You're with Press TV. It's now news review time. Palestine has slammed the UN decision not to include Israel on its blacklist of groups for violating children's rights. It says the world body has openly sided with the regime. Palestinian Foreign Ministry says the United Nations move would embolden Tel Aviv to continue committing organized terrorism and crimes against humanity. It says the decision has undermined the UN credibility. The ministry called on the world body to add Israel to its blacklist, citing the regime's gross violation of children's rights. Last month, the Tel Aviv regime launched a massive onslaught on the Gaza Strip, killing hundreds of civilians. 66 children and dozens of women were also among those killed. I'll now have a couple of guests to shed some more light on this and discuss it a bit further. Mona Candela, correspondent, is joining us from occupied Ramallah. We also have Marcus Papadopoulos, author and historian in London. Good to have you both on the show. Now over to Mona. First, tell us about how the Palestinian. I told the viewers what the Palestinian Authority thinks about this. Tell us about the reactions of other Palestinian factions and groups regarding this UN move.
Well, of course, the Palestinians are completely frustrated because the recent report by the United Nations, mainly by the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, he only called on the Israeli regime, the Israeli authorities, to reduce army operations against children. Reducing army operations, we are speaking about 66 Palestinian children were killed by the Israeli forces in the recent airstrikes and attack on the Gaza Strip. In addition to hundreds of Palestinians were wounded. Palestinian children were wounded in the Gaza Strip. Speaking about the children of the occupied West Bank and in Jerusalem, Al-Quds, Palestinians sometimes take part in peaceful demonstrations and protests against the confiscation of their lands, the demolition of their homes, of course, with their family members. During these demonstrations, the Israeli forces use means to force the Palestinians and to terrify them not to take part in the demonstrations. Instead of maybe using any means to stop the people, they use live rounds. They use their arms to shoot and kill Palestinians in cold blood, Palestinian children. Human rights organizations were speaking about a Palestinian who was shot dead in the village of Beita. He did nothing. He was taking part in a protest with his friends and family members. Instead of the Israeli army at least using fire to shoot and wound this Palestinian child, they killed him in cold blood. And instead of arresting children and allowing them to see their lawyers with their family members, they are completely denied their rights. That's why Palestinian Authority is completely frustrated. They criticize the United Nations, slam the decision by the UN Secretary of the Secretary General Antonio Guterres in order when he for leaving Israel of the annual blacklist of parties responsible for grave violations against the children. They are demanding the international community and the world to hold Israel accountable for carrying war crimes. These war crimes are not committed against Palestinian adults alone, but also against children. And the Palestinian Authority believes that the UN this time has sided with Israel, the occupying regime. Okay.
Now let's cross over to London. Marcus, why should the UN not be able to carry on its main responsibility? They have, issued lots of resolutions against the apartheid regime in Tel Aviv, but when it comes to such lists, they fall short of carrying out their responsibility. What keeps them away from doing this?
Well, we need to remind ourselves of what the United Nations actually is. The United Nations is comprised of 193 members, some of whom are sympathetic to Palestine, while others are sympathetic to Israel. But what is absolutely imperative in understanding why the United Nations only offers mild criticism of Israel and rarely, if ever, castigates Israel is because some of the most powerful members of the United Nations are vehemently supportive of Israel. Indeed, many of them have strategic partnerships with Israel. Some of the countries include America, Britain, Canada, France, and Germany. It therefore follows that those countries, which are, as I said, some of the most powerful on the international stage, not only abuse the United Nations, abuse the mechanisms of the United Nations for furthering their own interests and for threatening countries which do not bow down to their dictates, but the aforesaid countries also abuse the United Nations to cover and protect some of their friends and allies in the world. And Israel is, for instance, America's most important and trusted friend and ally in the Eastern Mediterranean and in the Middle East. Indeed, Israel is the main conduit for American power in the Middle East and also in North Africa. It therefore follows that the Americans will use their immense influence, which it exerts at the United Nations, to defend Israel. The Americans are savvy enough, are shrewd enough to know that the United Nations has to, from time to time, criticize the actions of the Israeli authorities vis-a-vis, for instance, the Palestinians, because otherwise the Americans know that the United Nations would not have an ounce of credibility in the world. However, the Americans will ensure that the United Nations does not go to the extent of castigating Israel, for instance, adding Israel to a list of countries, of governments which target and kill children, because that will be extremely damaging for Israel's reputation and therefore extremely damaging to America's reputation in the world. And as we all know, America's reputation in the world rests on a facade that America is the guardian, is the beacon of democracy and human rights in the world. So it's not a matter of the United Nations per se siding with Israel over Palestine. It's more a matter of some of the most powerful members of the United Nations use the United Nations as a weapon to further their own interests, right, to target countries such as Russia, Iran, and Syria, but also to provide cover for their friends and allies in the world, for instance, Israel.
Okay. Thank you very much for your comments and contribution. Mona Candela, correspondent Ramallah, and Marcus Papadopoulos, author and historian, joined us from London with their comments. And that's it for this news review.